high school. Most people see it as a place of learning, a location where the minds of youth can be molded and shaped to prepare them for life outside those stone walls. Others see it as a lawless wasteland of chaotic, hormonal teenagers, just trying to figure out their own place in the world. Some still hold on to that belief that high school was the best 4 years of their lives, as if acne and awkward relationships were the best thing to ever happen to them. My feelings on my school life fall mostly on indifference. While I barely remember my time there, some of the friendships I made I could never forget. Thinking back to the friends I had made in high school and all the crazy antics we got up to, it would always send waves of nostalgia running back through my mind. Unfortunately, shortly after graduating high school, my parents moved around a lot, taking me along with them. During those years, I bounced around from job to job. Eventually, I found one that actually stuck, which was surprising, and I've been working there ever since. The downside was that the job had to relocate me to another city, in a whole nother state. This put me farther away from my family and even farther away from my hometown. Due to this, I fell further and further out of touch with people from my past. People whom I used to call my best friends in school now just seem like former acquaintances. Despite all the advances in technology, I never really put in an effort to maintain connections with anyone from back then. I was always too caught up with my work or responsibilities to give my past much consideration. Time has a funny way of slipping past you when you least expect it to. A few years after joining the company, I had met my wife, Mary, and the years seemed to only pick up even faster. Before I knew it, nearly 20 years had passed since I had set foot in my hometown. One day, I had come home from work, and as I walked through the door, Mary informed me I had received a letter in the mail. I tossed my bag on the couch, poured a stiff drink, and opened the letter. I fully expected it to be yet another new bill to add to the pile, but I paused when I read the header. It said, "Cypress High welcomes you to the 20-year reunion for class of '99. As I sipped from my glass, I continued reading. It went on to mention the reunion was being hosted at the school itself, as well as a date this was to take place. I couldn't help the cheesy grin that spilled onto my face. Although I rarely thought about my past, the sudden abruptness of this letter sent it all flooding back. I was once again standing on those laminated floors between whitewashed walls, listening to that ear-shattering bell, indicating the next period, the scent of industrial floor cleaner from the night before still lingering in the air. The grin was short-lived, however, as I wondered how on earth the school had found my address. It seemed somewhat odd that they were still able to locate me after all this time. I suppose I hadn't truly been keeping myself a secret. I used social media about as much as the next guy, and on some of the sites my previous education had been listed. Before I started to overthink things, Mary spied over my shoulder and read the letter. She chimed in, asking me if I was going. I just shrugged with uncertainty as I finished my drink. I told her I still had a lot of work to do at the office, and she just shook her head. She told me that I'd been working basically non-stop for the last 2 years straight, something which I was well aware of. She told me that I needed a break, and this seemed like the perfect excuse. So, after some extended debating, I eventually caved, like I always did when it came to her, and decided I would at least go check it out. If I didn't like it, I could always check into a hotel and spend some time visiting old stomping grounds. I arrived at my hometown a little before sundown. I had around an hour before the event was supposed to occur, so I decided to spend that time driving around my old neighborhood. Each turn down a new street resurfaced a bunch of old memories. I was quite literally cruising down memory lane. Before I knew it, the sun had set and I realized just how late I had let my sightseeing run. I quickly turned onto the main road and tried my best to navigate back to my old high school. I drove to the edge of town, turned off a couple of side streets, and pulled onto the long, narrow driveway towards the large, darkened building in the distance. As I parked my car, I stared at the high school. It looked like a shell of its former self. The entire building looked weathered, almost run down even. I glanced around and only saw a handful of parked cars in the parking lot, so I just assumed that not many people had chosen to attend. I stepped out of my car and approached the school. The building was just as imposing as I remembered from my youth. I pulled open the front door and walked inside. I was instantly caught off guard by the lightless interior. Hazardous was a word that first came to mind, but I thought they might just be setting up a more atmospheric presentation. As I walked through the halls, I started to feel more and more unsure about this. The school, while visually like I remembered, it didn't quite feel the same. The whole building seemed lifeless, and not just because the lights were off. All of the classroom doors were shut, dust and grime coated the floor and the lockers, and the place just seemed like it hadn't been used in ages. While it was summer, I had assumed that they had just cut back on maintenance. I rounded one of the corners and saw a faint glow in the distance. There was a light coming from the doors to the gymnasium. I was beginning to feel a bit better after having my assumptions confirmed. I walked a bit quicker, hoping I wasn't too late to the event. My pace began to slow as I noticed something off about the door. There seemed to be some type of liquid pooling underneath it. As soon as I reached the door itself, a loud crash echoed from inside the gym, and the doors suddenly burst open. A man came flying out of the gym towards me, and I quickly backed up. The man slipped on the liquid and fell to the ground. When he did, I turned to look inside the gym, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The light, that I had first thought was ambient lighting, was numerous candles placed all along the floor. Amongst those candles were bodies. Bodies of various people were all lying on the ground, and on top of each of them was something. They looked strangely humanoid, but they clearly weren't human. Their forms were completely silver, like their bodies were made out of mirrors. Their fingers looked like jagged shards of glass, and were each piercing the chest of the people on the ground. They were all motionless. As I stared with my mouth agape, I felt something grab onto my foot and I immediately recoiled. I looked down and it was the man who had crashed through the doors. He looked up at me, and with a ragged breath, he just said a single word: "Run." Just then, one of those silver things crawled into the doorway and jumped onto the man, piercing his back with its long, sharp fingers. The thing turned its metallic face upwards towards me, and I watched as it slowly began to shift and change. After a few seconds, its silver visage changed to look exactly like the man it was on top of. Just then, I looked over and saw another one of those silvery things walking towards the door. It wasn't hard to tell that it was looking directly at me. I spun on my heels and dashed down the hallway. The clattering of my footfalls across the laminated floor seemed to echo endlessly. I didn't look back the entire time. I brought a leg up and kicked the front door of the building, sending it crashing open, and I ended up doubling over outside in the parking lot. As I stopped momentarily to take a breath, I looked back for the first time and saw it approaching the open doorway. I turned and continued sprinting to my car. I jumped inside and drove away as fast as my car would allow. As I was driving, after taking a few moments to collect my thoughts, I decided to call the police and let them know that I saw an altercation at the Cypress High 20-year reunion. After a moment of silence on the other end, the dispatcher stifled a scoff and asked if I was joking. She then explained that Cypress High hadn't been in use for nearly a decade. She said that school had closed down, and the students had been moved to a larger building on the other side of town, which had since been renamed. After I insisted this wasn't a joke, she reluctantly acknowledged my distress and confirmed that officers would be sent out that way to investigate. I drove straight home after that, not wanting to stick around to see what would happen. The entire drive home, I just kept coming up with excuses for what I saw, and after a few hours of driving, I decided it would be best to just repress the whole ordeal entirely. That was until a couple of days ago, when a letter arrived in the mail. It was addressed to my wife, and it was an invitation to her 20th High School Reunion. She was surprised they were even hosting such an event, especially with all that's been going on this year. She told me she was on the fence about going, telling me how nice it would be to see all her old friends again, especially after losing touch with them after all these years. A slight chill started to creep down my spine, however, as I heard her mention how odd it was that her school had somehow found her new mailing address after all these years.